She was just 6, sleeping on wet cardboard, hugging a teddy bear while the man who once called her princess drove by, not knowing she was his daughter. Lost 5 years ago in the rain. The rain had no mercy that night, slamming down in cold sheets against the empty streets, flooding gutters and whispering stories of those forgotten by the world, and there, beneath a flickering streetlight, on a piece of disintegrating cardboard, lay a little girl no older than 6, her tiny arms wrapped tightly around a threadbare teddy bear that had seen too many storms, its one button eye barely hanging on as if it too was trying to survive the night. Her hair clung to her cheeks like ivy. Her lips quivering not just from the cold but from something far deeper: loss, fear, abandonment, and every now and then, barely audible over the downpour, came a soft whisper from her mouth, a broken murmur, "Mommy, where are you?" As if the rain might carry her voice to someone who still cared. Her clothes were soaked, her fingers pale and trembling, her shoes missing as if she'd wandered too long before giving up right there on that street, with the only thing protecting her from the cruel wind being that fragile teddy bear she refused to let go of. Across the street, headlights cut through the rain like a blade through silence. A sleek black car rolling to a stop with precision. The engine still humming under the weight of wealth and importance, and from the back seat stepped a man in a sharp royal blue suit. His umbrella snapping open like a shield from the heavens, polished shoes clicking against wet concrete as he moved with purpose until his eyes landed on her. For a moment, he froze, not because he didn't know what to do, but because something inside him shattered. The way her tiny body curled in like a question mark, the soft shaking of her shoulders, the puddle forming beneath her cardboard bed, it all stabbed him in places he didn't know could still bleed. He stood still as memories he didn't recognize stirred like ghosts in his chest, and though he had faced boardrooms full of wolves and signed billion-dollar contracts without blinking, nothing prepared him for the sight of that little girl all alone in the rain. The sound of the storm seemed to fade as he knelt beside her, holding the umbrella over her tiny frame, and when he gently placed his coat over her shoulders, she stirred, eyes fluttering open with a fear that spoke of too many broken promises. Her face, smeared with dirt and tears, tilted upward slowly, and when their eyes met, he felt something unexplainable, as though he was looking into the past and future all at once. The world stopped spinning. The weight of the moment bore down on him like thunder, and for the first time in years, he felt small, not because he lacked power, but because he was standing before something so pure, so broken, and so deserving of love that it undid every piece of armor he wore. She didn't scream or speak right away, she just stared at him, holding that teddy bear like it was her whole world, and he felt ashamed that someone like her had been left to the streets while men like him slept in penthouses. The wind picked up, rustling the coat around her shoulders, and instinctively he pulled it tighter, crouching lower, shielding her from the downpour with his own body. Somewhere deep inside, a whisper echoed in his soul. "You've seen her before," but he couldn't place it. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "Sweetheart, are you alone?" But even asking felt cruel, because the answer was written all over her trembling frame. She nodded slowly, eyes wide and far too old for her age, as if life had forced her to grow up far too soon, and when he asked gently, "Where's your family?" she looked down, clutching the teddy tighter, and whispered something that barely made it past the rain. "I don't have one anymore." He swallowed hard, the air suddenly heavier, his heart pounding against ribs that hadn't felt this way in years. He didn't know why this moment was unraveling him, why this child's pain was cutting through layers of indifference he'd built to survive, but something about her was familiar. The night had a strange quiet now, even with the storm raging, as if destiny itself held its breath. The businessman, the millionaire, the man who'd come here to sign a deal, felt like a ghost next to this child because this moment wasn't about contracts or money or power. It was about humanity, fate, and something he hadn't dared believe in for a long time: miracles. And as he lifted her into his arms, the narrator's voice echoed softly in the background, like a lullaby meant only for them. He came to sign a deal. But destiny had other plans. His breath caught in his throat as her small, tear-streaked face looked up at him, those 6 words echoing louder in his soul than any boardroom applause ever had, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't blink, couldn't even swallow the lump that had formed in his throat because the pain in her eyes wasn't something he could just fix with money or words. It was deep, old, and carved into her spirit like scars you can't see. Her voice trembled as she clutched the teddy tighter, as if speaking had reopened wounds she had tried so hard to bury, and her small frame curled even tighter, not from the cold anymore, but from the shame of being unwanted in a world that should have loved her first. The man who had built empires and silenced crowds, with his presence now sat trembling in the rain, helpless before the quiet devastation of a little girl's story, one that shouldn't have belonged to anyone, let alone someone so young, so innocent, so deserving of love. Her lashes fluttered, trying to blink away tears that wouldn't stop, and with every word she spoke, he could feel his chest tightening, a heaviness sinking deeper with each breath. She told him how she used to wait at the door for her mother, holding a crayon drawing in her hand, hoping just once she'd be chosen over the new babies, but the door never opened for her. She whispered how her stepfather would lock her outside when he was in a bad mood, and how she learned not to cry too loudly because big girls don't get second chances. His jaw clenched, but not in anger, no, it was grief, helplessness, and the bitter realization that the world he thought he understood had far more cruelty in it than he'd ever dared to know. The rain dripped from her tangled curls, soaking his expensive coat that now clung to her tiny shoulders like a life raft in a sea of abandonment, and still she kept speaking, not because she trusted him yet, but because maybe, just maybe, the silence had finally become heavier than the fear. She said her mommy used to sing her to sleep before the accident, but now she only heard lullabies from the wind, and sometimes she pretended the rain was her daddy's voice, whispering from heaven that everything would be okay. His hands shook as he reached up to gently brush mud from her cheek, the coldness of her skin cutting through him sharper than ice, and when she flinched, he froze ashamed that she'd even expect harm from the only hand that had reached for her that night. No child should ever say that, he whispered again, but even as the words left his lips, they felt like a betrayal, because she had said it, she had lived it, and no apology or comfort could erase years of being unwanted. She looked at him then, eyes full of both wonder and hesitation, as if she didn't know whether to believe the warmth in his voice or prepare for the sting that usually followed. He took a shaky breath and pulled her gently into his arms, the storm roaring around them, but inside his chest, a different kind of storm had begun, one made of memories, questions, and something hauntingly familiar. She leaned into him slowly, her head resting near his heart, and in that fragile silence, he could feel her pulsy soft rhythm against his own, as if some unseen thread had stitched them together long before this night. The moment cracked something open in him that had been sealed for years, hidden beneath titles, luxury, and control, and all of it unraveled now with the sound of her soft sniffles against his chest. "Do you want to go home?" he asked. Barely above a whisper, and her answer wasn't words, it was the way her fingers gripped his soaked shirt like it was the only solid thing in her storm-filled world. He looked down at her and felt it again, that aching familiarity, a sense that this child wasn't a stranger, that somewhere, somehow, their stories had once touched. But before he could chase the thought, she whispered, "You smell like my real daddy." And the air left his lungs. His arms tightened just slightly, protectively, but his mind raced, his heart stumbled, and questions began swirling like the storm around them. Who was she really? Why did those words feel like a key turning in a long-locked door inside him? He didn't know it yet, but this wasn't just a rescue, it was the beginning of a truth buried in time, wrapped in tragedy, and waiting for a single spark to bring it all flooding back. World outside, as if even the storm dared not interrupt what fate had orchestrated beneath the leather roof of his luxury car. And while the raindrops tapped gently on the windows, he reached for a soft towel from the back seat and began carefully drying her tangled hair, every strand soaked and cold, like ivy left out in a frost. She sat still, fragile as glass, whispering faintly between shivers, "Teddy said it'll be okay." And though the words were soft, they struck him like thunder in his chest. He smiled faintly, though his heart ached, tucking a warm blanket around her shoulders with a care that felt instinctive, protective, like something he hadn't done in years but somehow remembered. The chauffeur looked back in confusion, unsure whether to ask questions, but one glance at the man's tear-glossed eyes told him not to say a word. They stopped at a quiet roadside diner glowing softly through the rain, and he carried her in his arms as though she weighed nothing, her tiny frame wrapped in warmth, her teddy bear peeking out from beneath the blanket like it too had been rescued. Inside, the warm air fogged the glass, and he gently helped her into a booth near the window, ordering chicken soup and a mug of warm milk without asking. Something in him just knew what she needed. She held the spoon with trembling fingers, trying to eat but spilling a little on the table, quickly wiping it up with the sleeve of her oversized blanket, looking up to see if he'd be mad. He wasn't. Instead, he smiled softly and said, "Take your time, Angel," and the kindness in his voice made her chest tighten like she hadn't felt safe in years. As she sipped the milk, cradling it with both hands like it was the only warmth she had, she glanced up at him and whispered, "Are you going to send me back?" The question pierced through him like an arrow, and he froze, the weight of that fear in her eyes breaking whatever strength he'd managed to hold together. He leaned forward slowly, his voice low and full of emotion. "No, sweetheart. I promise. Not anymore." Her eyes widened, just slightly, as if she'd never heard anyone promise something without needing anything in return, and when he reached out his hand across the table, she hesitated, then placed her tiny palm in his, and it was as if the universe held its breath. He brought her into his arms again, resting her gently against his chest, and this time she didn't pull away. She closed her eyes, letting out a sigh so soft it felt like the releasing of years of fear, and as the wind howled outside, she slept against him, safe for the first time in what felt like forever. He ran his hand gently down her back, trying to understand why his soul felt like it had known her long before tonight, why holding her felt like returning to something lost, not discovering something new. A single tear escaped his eye, rolling down his cheek and disappearing into her damp curls, and he didn't wipe it away, because that tear didn't belong to pain, it belonged to something deeper, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel since the day everything in his life had fallen apart. The diner lights flickered as the storm raged on, but inside that small booth, time slowed to a gentle crawl, and the man who was once lost in wealth and noise finally found silence in the heartbeat of a little girl he didn't yet know was his. The waitress, watching from afar, paused mid-step, touched by the tenderness in a scene she hadn't expected, a rich man cradling a homeless child like she was made of porcelain and stars. And the narrator's voice came like a whisper through the storm, wrapping around the moment like a lullaby. He didn't know why. But something about her felt like home. The diner buzzed softly with late-night quiet, the only real sound the soft clinking of silverware and the occasional hum of the coffee machine behind the counter, but his world suddenly slowed to a crawl as she reached forward with her tiny hand to grab a napkin, the blanket slipping down her arm just enough to reveal a small patch of pale skin, and there, just above her wrist, rested a distinct mark, shaped like a delicate crescent moon, faint but unmistakable. His heart stopped. The spoon in his hand dropped to the table without him noticing, his breath frozen halfway in his lungs as he leaned closer, eyes locked on that tiny shape, and the world around him dissolved. The air grew colder, not from the weather, but from the rush of memories that slammed into him like a tidal wave, dragging him back through years he had buried and mourned. "That's impossible," he whispered under his breath, his voice almost broken, and suddenly the rain outside felt like echoes of the night he had tried so hard to forget. His eyes burned, not just from the shock, but from the pain he'd long sealed away, and in a flash, his mind was pulled into a memory that haunted him like a ghost waiting in silence. It was 5 years ago, the night of the accident, the night everything vanished. He and his wife had driven through the woods after a late birthday picnic for their baby girl, laughter still in their voices, music playing low, her tiny giggle echoing from the back seat like the purest song he'd ever heard. Then the lights, bright, sudden, blinding. The crash tore through metal, glass, and time itself. When he opened his eyes, everything was smoke and fire. He remembered reaching for the back seat, screaming her name, but the pain in his chest kept pulling him under, and before he could even call for help, the river swallowed him whole. They said they searched. They said they couldn't find his body. They told his wife he was gone, and when she woke up, broken and alone in a hospital bed, holding only their daughter's teddy bear, she screamed for him until her voice went raw. Days turned into weeks, then months, and eventually, the world declared him dead. But what no one knew, what even he barely remembered, was how he clawed his way out of that icy water, his body shattered, his memory scattered, washed miles downstream, half dead and unrecognizable, until a fisherman found him barely breathing and brought him to a clinic across the state. He had no ID, no memory, just flashes of screams, a little girl's laugh, and a crescent moon birthmark he couldn't explain. It took him years to rebuild, piece by piece, name by name, until he reclaimed the empire he once lost. But the family? The life? He never went back. He believed no, he was told they didn't survive. Until now. Until this girl. Sitting across from him. With that mark. That very same crescent moon. She was 6. The same age his daughter would be. The same soft curls. The same sky-colored eyes. And as she looked up at him, confused by his sudden silence, her little fingers still wiping the corner of her mouth, he couldn't breathe. Do you remember your first daddy? He asked, the question shaking on his tongue like a storm trapped in words. She nodded slowly, unsure. Just his voice. Mommy said he went to heaven after the car crashed. But sometimes I think he's still looking for me. The diner lights blurred as tears filled his eyes, and though logic told him it was impossible, every cell in his body screamed the same truth: this is her. This is my baby girl. But how? Why now? And what happened after he disappeared? The ache in his chest was unbearable, not from doubt, but from the terrifying possibility that the life he thought was lost might have been waiting for him all along. He watched as she turned her wrist, oblivious to the storm inside him, gently drawing a heart in the condensation on the window, her reflection glowing beneath the neon diner sign. He blinked, and for a split second, he saw his wife's face in hers, the same smile, the same softness, and something inside him shattered, not in pain this time, but in hope. That hope was dangerous, he knew. But it was all he had now. The narrator's voice returned, gentle as a whisper in the dark. Some marks fade from the skin, but never from the soul. His gaze remained frozen on her birthmark as the world around him faded, and deep within the silence of that diner booth, the floodgates of memory cracked wide open, dragging him backward into the night that rewrote everything 5 years ago, a night that started with laughter and ended in smoke. It had been his daughter's first birthday, and he'd insisted on a moonlit drive after dinner, just the three of them, his wife beside him, cradling their baby girl who had just started to say, Dada, in the softest voice that melted his heart every time. They were wrapped in warmth and soft lullabies, and the stars above seemed to bless them with light, but fate had already turned its back. One wrong turn through the forest road. One flash of headlights, one truck barreling toward them without mercy. The crash came with no time to scream, metal twisting, glass exploding, the car spinning, and then silence as darkness swallowed the road. He remembered the sharp pain in his ribs, the smell of smoke, the sound of his wife sobbing faintly from somewhere nearby, calling his name again and again. He had reached out, but the door wouldn't move. His fingers fumbled for the baby seat, but something hit his head and everything turned black. When he awoke, cold and disoriented, the car was submerged halfway in the river, the current ripping through it like claws. His daughter was gone from the back seat, and so was his wife. Panic took over. He kicked the shattered glass and pulled himself out with blood-soaked hands, coughing water, dragging himself toward the shore. But the river was merciless, yanking him under again and again, tossing his body through branches and rocks like a toy in the hands of fate. Somehow, sheer will or perhaps love kept him alive. He clawed through the water, lungs burning, vision blurring, until the current spat him out miles downstream like a forgotten secret. Barely alive, half-conscious, and stripped of everything, his wallet, his phone, even his name, he collapsed on the muddy bank as the sun began to rise. A passing fisherman found him hours later, bloody and shaking, with a weak pulse and no memory of who he was. He spent weeks in a rural clinic, drifting in and out of lucidity, haunted by dreams of a little girl's laughter and a woman's cries, flashes of soft curls, a cake with one candle, and a teddy bear floating in the water. No one claimed him. No one searched that far. The news said the businessman Dominic Hartley had died in a car accident, his wife critically injured and rescued, the daughter's status unclear. But the body was never recovered. The world buried him. The company passed to distant hands. And the woman he loved, believing him dead, had disappeared from headlines and memory alike. When his strength returned, he wandered aimlessly through towns, trying to piece together the fragments of a life no one else remembered. Slowly, he rebuilt not just his health, but his empire. A new name, a new identity. He rose again like a man who had conquered death. But the one thing he never rebuilt was hope. He told himself the girl was gone. That his wife had moved on. That even if they had survived, they were better off without the broken, half-man who had crawled out of a grave. And so, He sealed the past like a tomb and never looked back. Not until tonight, not until that mark. That child. That voice. It all came rushing back with a clarity that suffocated him. His hands trembled as he remembered the softness of his daughter's giggle, the way she used to fall asleep in his arms while holding the very same teddy bear now tucked under the diner table. He had buried those sounds in silence. And now, they screamed. The memory of that night wasn't just pain anymore, it was a bridge. And for the first time since that cursed river tore them apart, Dominic knew something he hadn't dared believe. The past wasn't lost. It had just been waiting. The silence in the car was heavy as they drove through the misty hills toward the mansion, the kind of silence that wasn't empty but overflowing, trembling with truths waiting to be spoken, hearts waiting to be shattered or made whole. The little girl sat in the back seat wrapped in the soft blanket he'd given her, her teddy resting in her lap, and though her eyelids fluttered with exhaustion, her gaze stayed fixed on the man beside hers, if something in her heart already knew what her memory hadn't yet caught up to. The iron gates of the estate opened slowly, groaning like secrets being unlocked, and as the car pulled into the long driveway lined with manicured hedges and flickering lamps, the mansion loomed like a monument from a forgotten life. One he never thought he'd revisit, with pieces of his past walking beside him. He carried her up the marble steps like something sacred, not letting her feet touch the cold ground, and as the grand double doors opened, the warm golden light from inside spilled onto her face, illuminating her soft curls like a halo. Inside, the hallway stretched long and silent, portraits hanging on the walls like memories trapped in paint. The fireplace crackled in the distance, but neither of them noticed it was the photo that caught her eye. A framed picture just to the left of the grand staircase. She stopped mid-step, her small fingers slipping from his hand, and suddenly she was running, barefoot and breathless, across the polished floor. She stood beneath the frame, her voice rising like a gasp from her chest. "That's my mommy." The sound of those 3 words echoed off the marble, louder than any thunder. His knees buckled, and the air fled from his lungs as if someone had knocked the wind out of his soul. He staggered forward, unable to process what he'd just heard. She turned to him, eyes bright with wonder, not realizing the ground beneath his world was crumbling. "That's her. She sings to me sometimes. She has this necklace with a gold heart. Mommy never takes it off," she said proudly, pointing at the woman in the photo, his wife. His one true love. Alive in color, frozen in time, her smile radiant in that picture he hadn't touched since the night of the accident. The walls closed in around him as the truth began pressing in from all sides. His heart pounded. He knelt before the girl, his voice barely a breath. "Sweetheart, what's your name?" She looked at him, tilting her head slightly as if the question was silly. "Emily," she said. "Emily Blake." The sound of it hit him like a storm surge, crashing against everything he thought he had rebuilt. Blake. His name. Not a coincidence. Not an echo. But a truth that unraveled every lie he had told himself to survive. His throat tightened as tears burned behind his eyes, and when he tried to speak, no words came, just a sound, raw and broken, like a man remembering how to feel. He collapsed onto the floor, his hands covering his face, sobs breaking free for the first time in years. It wasn't just grief, it was recognition, it was joy, it was guilt, and it was the indescribable ache of reunion without preparation. She reached for him, confused and gentle, her tiny fingers brushing his sleeve. "Are you okay?" she asked, and he looked up through blurred vision, nodding even as his shoulders trembled. "Yes, baby, I've waited so long to hear your name," he choked out. Her head tilted, curious. "Have we met before?" And though he wanted to scream, "Yes, every night in my dreams," he simply gathered her into his arms and held her tighter than the world itself. She didn't resist. She rested her head on his chest, as if something inside her already knew this heartbeat, at this rhythm of safety. As the fire crackled in the distance and the night wrapped its silence around the house, a soft narrator's voice broke the quiet like a lullaby. "Sometimes, the heart remembers what the mind forgets. Because destiny never does." As the firelight flickered behind them and Emily's breathing softened in his arms, Dominic knew this moment wasn't the end, it was only half the story, and the other half was still out there, hurting, waiting, surviving in silence. He laid her gently in the guest room, tucked the blanket under her chin, and kissed her forehead with a tenderness only a father could carry, then closed the door with a silent vow in his chest. I will find her. That night, he called in the one man who had never failed him, a private investigator he trusted with his life and handed over everything, old names, known cities, a faded wedding photo he hadn't looked at in years. Find her, he said, voice raw. She's alive. I know it. Days passed with agonizing slowness, each hour a reminder of how much time they'd lost. And then came the call. A small town 3 hours away. A woman matching her description, working at a pharmacy. Married, but isolated. Dominic drove himself. He couldn't wait. He had to see her with his own eyes, not through photos or second-hand reports. The town was quiet, nestled between worn hills and forgotten roads, the kind of place people disappear into when the world no longer makes room for their pain. He parked down the block and watched from a distance. And there she was, his wife. No makeup, dark circles beneath her eyes, her hair tied back in a rushed, weary knot. But her walk still had that same softness, and her eyes. God! Her eyes still carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken nights. He didn't approach. Not yet. Instead, he asked around carefully, listened to whispers from shopkeepers and neighbors who looked away when her husband's name was mentioned. The picture became clearer and uglier. She had tried to leave after the wedding turned into a trap, but the man she'd married out of desperation had revealed a monster behind the smile. She endured the bruises, the screams, the nights spent shielding herself with locked doors, not for herself, but to keep Emily safe. She stayed because she thought there was no escape. She stayed because she believed he'd kill them both if she ran. And then one day, her little girl didn't come home. The man said Emily wandered off. Maybe drowned. Maybe taken. No body was ever found. But the pain did what death could not. It shattered her. And in the quiet of her grief, she whispered her daughter's name to the stars each night, hoping somehow she was still breathing under the same sky. Dominic watched her place medicine on the shelf with trembling hands, watched how she flinched when someone walked behind her too fast. Her smile was broken. Her shoulders curled in like she was trying to disappear, and he couldn't breathe. All those years he'd believed she moved on. All those years thinking she forgot him. But she hadn't. She had been surviving. Suffering. Fighting to protect the daughter they both thought was lost. Rage boiled in his veins, not at her but at the man who had stolen her light. At fate for twisting their love into suffering. He clenched the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, but he didn't storm in. This had to be done right. She couldn't endure another shock. Not without preparation. Not without proof. He would bring Emily to her. Let the truth unfold, not with force but with healing. He would give her back the daughter she mourned. He would give her back a life she believed was buried beneath tragedy. He sat in the car for hours, memorizing every detail of her presence, the way she wiped her hands on her apron, the soft way she whispered, "Thank you," to customers, the brief glances toward the door as if hoping someone, someday, might walk in and bring her peace. And as night fell and she locked up the store with tired fingers, he made another silent vow, "You're not alone anymore. I found you. And I'm bringing her home." The next evening, as the stars blinked awake in the cold sky, Dominic sat alone in his study, staring at his phone like it was the heaviest thing he'd ever held. His thumb hovered over the screen, hesitating not out of fear, but reverence. This call wasn't business. This was resurrection. He dialed with trembling hands, blocking the number, his heart pounding like a drum in a cathedral. She answered on the third ring, her voice soft, exhausted, unfamiliar yet unmistakably hers. "Hello?" And then, silence. Just his breath. Just hers. He didn't speak her name. He didn't have to. "It's me," he whispered, like a prayer finally finding its way home. On the other end, a sharp gasp and then a crash. She had dropped the phone. He waited, breathless, afraid she might never pick it back up. But when she did, her voice shook like the walls of a heart caving in. "You're alive?" He swallowed hard. "I found her." That was all he needed to say. The line went quiet again, but he heard it, the sob. Small, raw, and aching. And then the call ended without another word. But that silence said more than 1,000 conversations. The next morning, the sun rose timidly, as if unsure how to shine on a day like this. He dressed Emily in a warm yellow dress with soft ribbons and brushed her curls gently, trying to steady his trembling fingers. She looked up at him and asked, "Why are your eyes shiny?" He smiled, kissed her forehead, and said, "Because my heart is finally waking up." The drive was quiet. Emily held her Teddy close, looking out the window with curiosity, unaware of how the world was about to shift. When they reached the quiet house nestled behind the crooked fence, he got out first, gently lifting her into his arms. He didn't ring the bell. The door opened before he even knocked. She stood there, his wife frozen in the doorway like a statue built from heartbreak and disbelief. Their eyes met across years of silence, and her hand flew to her mouth as her knees buckled. But before she could fall, Emily slipped down from his arms and ran forward. "Mommy?" Her voice was soft, unsure, like a question she'd asked 1,000 times in dreams. Her mother collapsed to her knees, arms outstretched, and Emily flew into them like a bird returning to the nest she thought was destroyed. No words were spoken, just gasps, sobs, and the kind of trembling that shakes the soul more than the skin. Dominic didn't move. He stood in the corner of the porch, his hand gripping the post like it was the only thing holding him up. His chest hurt. His lungs burned. But his heart was finally whole. They held each other for minutes that felt like lifetimes. Fingers clutching fabric. Tears soaking skin. Emily's small hand reaching to wipe her mother's tears, whispering, "It's really you." Her mother kissed her 100 times in seconds, whispering her name like a sacred chant. "Emily. Emily. My baby. My baby girl." Then, after what felt like forever, Emily turned, her eyes wide with something pure and old. She looked between them both, the woman who gave her life and the man who gave her safety, and she smiled the kind of smile that could crack the heavens. "I always knew," she said, simply. "My real daddy would come back for me." Time froze. His eyes met his wife's across the porch, and in that moment, they weren't broken people, they were survivors of the same war, carrying the same scar, and now, holding the same miracle. Emily took both their hands, one in each of her tiny palms, and pulled them together like she'd done it 1,000 times before. No orchestra played. No sunbeam shone through the clouds. Just a quiet truth settling in the air. Destiny had waited long enough. The moment Emily's tiny hands joined theirs, something sacred sealed between them, a bond long broken now quietly mending. But Dominic knew that healing the heart wasn't enough. Justice had to follow. That night, as Emily slept curled between her parents on the living room couch, wrapped in warmth she'd only dreamed of, Dominic made calls, quiet, urgent, and deliberate. The man who had haunted their lives for years wouldn't disappear into the shadows. Not this time. By morning, the best legal team in the state had been dispatched. Documents were filed. Statements collected. Medical records and neighbor testimonies unearthed. He used every ounce of influence he had, not for power or profit but to protect the two souls that meant everything to him. The man's past came unraveling like an old rug, multiple complaints, sealed records, even restraining orders from another town. Everything that was once buried was now exposed to daylight, and Dominic made sure there would be no more hiding. When the officers arrived at the small house behind the crooked fence, they didn't knock gently. The arrest was swift, the screams desperate, but the handcuffs were tight and final. Emily's mother stood at the police station, watching silently through the glass as the man who had stolen years from her life was finally taken away. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence roared louder than any courtroom speech. Back at the mansion, Emily woke up to soft sunlight pouring through pink curtains she didn't recognize, blinking as her eyes adjusted to the softest bed she'd ever laid in. Teddy was beside her, cleaner than ever, wearing a new bow. Her eyes wandered around the room, walls painted in gentle rose, shelves filled with books, stuffed animals, and a small dresser with a glittery nameplate, Emily's World. She slipped out from under the covers and tiptoed across the room, her tiny fingers brushing the soft rug beneath her feet. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid to wake up. No yelling. No banging doors. Just birds chirping, and the faint scent of pancakes wafting from downstairs. Her mother was waiting in the kitchen, apron on, trying not to cry as she flipped a pancake shaped like a heart. Dominic sat at the island counter, smiling through eyes that still held too many storms, but finally some sun. Emily ran into their arms, and they laughed not the laughter of cartoons or jokes but of relief, of safety. That night, as she crawled into her new bed with Teddy in one arm and a book in the other, she looked at her father and said, "Can you stay until I fall asleep?" He nodded, pulling up a chair beside her. She rested her head on the pillow, breathing steady, her small hand reaching out until it found his. "You make the monsters go away," she whispered, eyes already fluttering closed. He kissed her forehead, whispering, "They'll never come back, princess. Not ever again." Down the hall, her mother watched from the doorway, tears glistening on her cheeks, not from pain this time but from the overwhelming beauty of seeing her child sleep in peace. No flinching. No crying in her sleep. Just dreams. Just softness. Just love. And as the mansion filled with quiet hums of a life reborn, Dominic leaned back, realizing justice wasn't just about punishment, it was about building a world where the innocent could finally rest without fear. Emily's pink nightlight cast a warm glow across her face, and Tedino sitting upright at her side seemed to smile, too. For the first time in forever, she was safe. She was home. Weeks passed like whispers, each day softer than the last, as healing settled into the walls of the mansion like a long-awaited guest. The house that once echoed with emptiness now pulsed with laughter, music, and the warmth of a family rediscovered. And today, the sun rose with a special glow, as if the sky itself knew that something sacred was being celebrated. Inside the grand hall, the walls were wrapped in soft pink and gold balloons, streamers cascading from the ceiling like ribbons of joy. A table stood near the window, covered in a spread of cupcakes, fruit punch, and a towering cake crowned with 6 delicate candles, each one flickering like a promise reborn. Emily stood at the center of it all, glowing brighter than the sunlight, wearing a sharp pink frock with a satin bow, her curly blonde hair tied back with a sky-blue ribbon that danced each time she twirled. Her eyes sparkled with a joy that once felt impossible, and as she looked around the room, there was no fear in her gaze, only wonder. Her mother stood near the archway, watching her with a smile that trembled on the edge of tears, and Dominic her father stood proudly beside them, dressed not in power or prestige today, but in softness, in gratitude, in love. When it came time to open the presents, Emily sat cross-legged on a velvet cushion, with her parents on either side, both reaching out instinctively to hold her hands. The room fell quiet as she picked up the final box, a small one, wrapped in gold paper, and tied with a ribbon the color of the morning sky. She untied it slowly, curiosity widening her eyes. Inside, nestled in soft pink tissue, was a brand new teddy bear plush, warm, and stitched with a tiny heart on its chest. She gasped softly, her fingers tracing the bear's soft fur, and then she noticed the folded card resting underneath. She opened it with careful hands, her lips moving silently as she read the message inside. "This time, forever. Love, Daddy." Her hands trembled as she clutched the note to her chest, her eyes filling not with sadness, but with something deeper. She turned slowly to her father, tears slipping down her cheeks as a smile bloomed like spring on her face. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible, yet somehow louder than anything in the room. "Thank you for coming back." Dominic blinked hard, but the tears won. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead gently, reverently, then reached for his wife's hand without looking, and she found his with the same instinctual grace, their fingers interlocking like a lock finding its key. Emily leaned against his shoulder, the new bear in her lap, while her mother rested her head against his other side, and for a long, quiet moment, they just sat there. No words, no fears, just presence. Just peace. Outside, the trees swayed gently, and the garden beyond the window bloomed brighter than ever, touched by sun and rain and time. The camera slowly pulled back, the family growing smaller in the frame but larger in the heart, framed by the soft glow of a home not just restored but reborn. And just as the screen faded into warm light, the narrator's voice returned one last time, soft and steady like a lullaby. "Sometimes, even the rain brings us back to the ones we never stopped loving."